Not quite yet. Go.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to this, our 13th annual Leon Levy Lecture and Biography. Each year, we select one eminent writer to talk about their journey through the art and craft of biography. This year, we are honoring the celebrated author and journalist, Judith Thurman, who has entitled her lecture, The Accidental Biographer. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision. She is gambling that by investing in biographers, she will be nurturing a whole new generation of public intellectuals, deeply immersed in the human condition and thus uniquely capable of helping us to understand both the past and the way forward. The results are already clear because over the last 13 years, the Leon Levy Center has funded year-long sabbaticals for 54 working biographers who have now published 23 major books, and many more are to come. These are trying, difficult times, and I sorely wish we could be meeting in person in CUNY's Grand Proshansky Auditorium and adjourning afterwards for an intimate dinner with our illustrious biographer. But this is our world in this moment in time. You would think that biographers are by nature uniquely conditioned to survive pandemics. We are, after all, solitary souls, doing our work alone in the archives for years, inspecting dusty diaries and aging correspondence, page by page, and then retreating to our writing studies to churn out the words that recreate a life story. But the truth is that we biographers are actually quite social beings. We are deeply interested in the human story. And usually, after long hours of working alone, we try to escape to a nice restaurant and reward ourselves with a good meal, a glass of red wine, and the company of another writer. My friend and occasional biographer, the late Christopher Hitchens, once said, quote, "Good writing is in some degree dependent on good conversation, and solitary stupefaction isn't any good for that purpose." We may be hermits, but like everyone, we draw strength and energy from community. Sadly, the pandemic has forced all of us writers to retreat into our work. We have nothing to do but write. I don't know if that is healthy or not, but I predict that some years from now, publishers will be deluged with a wave of manuscripts. And maybe that will be a good thing. In any case, tonight we are delighted to honor Judith Thurman. Judith Thurman has been contributing to The New Yorker since 1987. She has been a staff writer for The New Yorker for the last 20 years, specializing in profiles and cultural criticism. She is the author of Isak Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller, which won the 1983 National Book Award for Nonfiction and served as the basis for Sidney Pollack's Oscar-winning film, Out of Africa. Her second biography, Secrets of the Flesh, A Life of Colette, won the Los Angeles Times and the Salon Book Awards for biography. She is also the author of Cleopatra's Nose, 39 Varieties of Desire, a collection of her essays. Judith, I now turn the evening over to you, and I only wish we could share a meal afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kai. That was a wonderful introduction. And it reminded me in the early years, early months of the pandemic, it came to me that it must have been a biographer who coined the expression happy as a clam, because there was no distraction from work and sort of a wonderful and strange period of suspension. I'm really honored to be the 13th annual lecturer in this series, and I'm deeply grateful to not only for the honor for me, but to everything that the Leon Levy Center does for biography and for biographers. Many younger writers have received its largesse and have been able to work on important books because of it. I would also like to thank all of you for being there in the dark. I can't see anyone. I understand that the house is full, so I will start. I'd like to begin by reading you a few lines from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's majority opinion in the case of the United States versus Virginia, a lawsuit that challenged segregation by gender at the Virginia Military Institute, and which on the surface would seem to have nothing whatsoever to do with biography. Generalizations about the way women are, RBG wrote, the way women are was in quotes, no longer justify denying opportunity to women whose talent and capacity place them outside the average description. It struck me, reading Justice Ginsburg's obituary on Saturday morning, that confronting generalizations about the way women are has been my life's work as a critic and a biographer. Justice in literature is different from legal justice, but I am sure that RBG, who had studied with Nabokov at Cornell, would agree that they both share an ideal of unsparing specificity. It is, I believe, the task of every writer, in every genre, in every sentence, to litigate with received ideas, her own to begin with. Disbelief is essential to good writing, which in my own experience has been a line-by-line combat with self-forgery. I'm only fully real to myself when I've written a sentence which surprises me with the truth that has been hiding in plain sight. A piece of prose can lie on the page, bristling with cleverness, yet inert, until you hit upon the precise sequence of words, the spell, if you like, that brings it to life. At that moment, language recovers its archaic power to free a trapped spirit. My occasional triumphs of insight seem to occur by accident, since I never know what I mean to say or what I feel about a subject at the outset. The unknowing has a nightmarish quality that Colette captures in the image of quitting work for the day and leaving on her desk a blazing branch of forsythia, only to return the next morning to find a shriveled twig. My career as a biographer also began by accident. I graduated from university 53 years ago with a BA in English literature and no interest in teaching. Academia struck me as an anxious, gray, and rather melancholy neighborhood to settle in as a young person, rather like the old Upper West Side. Or perhaps I avoided it because I feared that I was too well suited for the marmish role of what was then still called a lady professor. But it may shock my younger listeners to hear that in 4 years of college at Brandeis, a radical hotspot, where Angela Davis was a graduate student when I was a freshman, I only had one woman professor. She happened to be the charismatic Hortense Kalischer, a writer in residence, and I think she left after a semester. It was a man's world. Literature has never entirely been a man's world. I knew from an early age that I wanted to write, but not what. Does any child, however bookish, dream of becoming a biographer? Perhaps if she's born into a clan like the Longfords, Pakenhams, Frasers, Billingtons, and Poles, but the thought never crossed my mind. Poetry was my first love, and I was still a teenager when the Times published one of my verses on its editorial page. How quaint that feature seems today, as quaint as civility in the public sphere. The daily poem was a space reserved for quiet meditation, like a vest pocket park in Midtown. I wish they would revive it. Thinking about my trajectory, I realize that it has been shaped, perhaps unduly, by a reactive character rather than a decisive one, and by chance encounters with persuasive individuals, most of them friends, lovers, mentors, or godparents, but some of them dead writers, who have suggested or at times even insisted that I go here or there, try this or that, take a wild risk. Don't be overwise, Dostoevsky counsels you. Fling yourself straight into life without too much deliberation. Dinesen puts it more concisely, more coquettishly too, in the motto she chose for her life as a storyteller. Pourquoi pas? Why not? Both my biographies and many of my profiles for The New Yorker, which are sort of haiku bios, if you like, though they require an expensive research, reading, and synthesis disproportionate to their word count, were undertaken at the behest of others, a subject I'll return to. But I often wonder what my career might have been like with more initiative, or with less of an inclination to seek approval, that old good girl syndrome. I've never transcended my fear of being a disappointment, and I haven't transcended it this evening. Expecting too much of oneself is a hazard of being female in a culture that expects too little. Shame is another hazard. Shame in particular for one's desires where they don't conform to the generalizations. With one notable exception, my subjects all had doubts about being what Colette called, enviously, a real woman. The exception was Julia Margaret Cameron, the 19th century pioneer of photography, who managed the remarkable feat of accomplishing everything that convention expected of her as a mother and a matron, without sacrificing any of the originality that she demanded of herself. And if one can believe the evidence, a very big if, since the study of photography, like the practice of writing lives, instills in one a healthy skepticism toward the notion of objective truth, she was that rarest of creatures, a sovereign artist content with her lot as a little woman. The irony, however, is that my own perennial insecurity about who I am and about what I'm worth has proved to be an asset in writing about the mysterious, often tortured process by which my subjects became who they were. One of those mysteries is why some glamorous, eventful lives are in fact repetitive and depressing, and why some chaste, secluded lives, like those of the Bronte sisters or of Emily Dickinson, are so riveting that they continue to be rewritten. A friend of mine, a Danish biographer, once described his vocation by saying, "I track the process of individuation to the point at which it fails." It's that drama, I believe, that gives a biography its suspense and cuts through the trivia of a life to its vital essence. A worthwhile biography may be the distillation of someone else's experience, yet it doesn't read like a second-hand report in the sentences of a great biographer. Why is that? A common fallacy is that you have to identify with your subject to do her justice, but that's precisely what you mustn't do. You must, however, at all costs and at every point, especially the moral nadirs in a life, identify with her humanity by interrogating the blind spots in your own and the tin spots in your ear. Long before I became Dinesen's biographer, she was one of those persuasive figures who helped me to set a course in life, or more accurately, to deviate from a course, a shallow coastal one, and head for the open water. When a college roommate who lived in Italy invited me to spend a month with her the year I graduated, 1967, I took all my savings and bought a ticket. I had earned the money in the course of 3 summers as a high school student when I rode the RR train, it used to be the double R, from Queens into Manhattan, and worked as a file clerk in an advertising agency, advancing at 16 to become a junior copywriter. Our principal client was a company that owned a chain of beauty salons. I guess my interest in fashion started there. My very first published writing appeared daily, I might brag, in the form of newspaper ads all over the country, in states I have still never been to, for wash and wear specials, that was a permanent wave, and for youthful feather cuts. But my proudest achievement was a shameless little pun. A wig of beauty is a joy for weather. Who knows how far I might have gone in that racket? I might by now, like Mary Wells Lawrence, the doyenne of ad women, be quarantining on my yacht. At 20, however, I discovered the old world. Europe was inexhaustibly suggestive, as America was not, at least to a provincial like me. Nearly every aspect of life there, class, speech, dress, food, decor, architecture, religion, families, politics, and sex, especially sex, was coded in a manner both fascinating and arcane to me. I set out to make myself a cosmopolite, and I stayed abroad for the next 5 years. Decrypting the codes was excellent training for my future vocation, and without knowing it, I was carving out a niche, the lives of foreigners with exotic backgrounds to which my own bore no obvious relation. By the early 70s, I had settled in London where life was cheap. You could buy used paperbacks for a shilling. My room in a shared house south of the river, a glorified closet, cost £3 a week. I did some office work for the Poetry Society in Earl's Court and tutored the son of a movie mogul in Berkeley Square, carefully wrapping up the lumps of brown sugar from the tea tray that a butler served us when we'd finished our French lesson. I loved London's heady reek of kerosene and patchouli, curry and diesel fumes. I had a small circle of indigent friends and a few grand ones who corrected my faux pas. Left-handed Americans, one told me, cannot be expected to have manners. But then as now, solitude was my default mode, and I traveled alone to exotic places. Marrakesh and the Atlas Mountains, the Mani in southern Greece, the west coast of Scotland, the Extremadura. Occasionally, a misguided local tried to molest me and was shocked at the fury that he unleashed, though not more than I was. An important chapter in my sentimental education took place in the kitchen. The mother of a French boyfriend had taught me how to cook. My own mother specialized in Stauffer's Welsh rarebit. And on the basis of a trial souffle, I was hired as a chef by Sidney Nolan, the Australian painter, and his wife Cynthia, a gifted travel writer. The job came with a garden flat in their Putney mansion by the river, which was filled with his paintings, a Ned Kelly, a mammoth anthill, and with the scent of hyacinths, which still brings me back there. I fed many artists and started a novel between their meals, but unlike my aspics, it didn't gel. I've never been able to make things up. The greatest luxury of those years was their freedom to improvise an identity. My life was a cocoon and my writing a private, still larval occupation. The world hadn't yet put a value on it. My rivalries were private too, with poets whom I had never met. And the tension that accompanies all literary departures, the choosing of a path, the entrance into a dark place, its claustrophobia, the fear of not emerging on the other side, of finishing what once begun, was sustainable for the duration of a lyric. Those years abroad, however, slackened my grip on American English. Alienation from one's mother tongue is a great danger for a writer, unless you're Beckett or Nabokov. Many of my intimate relations were conducted in a foreign language, but British English was possibly more subversive. I began to sound like one of those announcers on a late-night classical radio station who enunciates every syllable in a different accent. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. When people started complimenting my English, it was time to go home. I had decided by then to live by my pen, which meant at the outset subtitling a silly pornographic movie and translating the interview that a philosophy professor had conducted with Jean-Paul Sartre. The professor could speak just enough French to ask the questions, but not enough to understand the answers, a predicament one encounters all too frequently in biography. The most exciting of my jobs was as an escort interpreter for the State Department, for which I traveled the country with official guests. It required that I take a good many poetic liberties interpreting their conversations with hosts and officials, since Americans have an unfortunate tendency to leave their sentences unfinished, whereas French speakers cannot or will not understand a grammatically incomplete phrase. So I often found myself filling in the blanks. And that's another danger in our profession. One can supply too much intention. Meanwhile, I was translating poetry. Louise Labey, a 16th century French courtesan, which is to say, a woman who owned her desires, and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a 17th century Mexican nun who tried heroically to own hers, were among my subjects. So it was varied work, and it grew into my first foray as a biographer, a book of essays on women writers for young adults, published in 1975. One of the writers was Dinesen, who gave me my title, I Became Alone. I may have to reuse it for a memoir of old age. Biography and translation are sister arts, since a biographer is always working in a foreign language, or more precisely in a foreign idiom, the experience of another human being. Acquiring fluency is a slow process, and that's one reason that a good biography takes years of immersion. You have to accustom your ear to the rhythms of a life, its logic and illogic, its patterns of repetition. The early years are spent almost entirely in the language lab of your subject's correspondence, listening to her voice both soliloquizing and in dialogue with her family and contemporaries. That counterpoint helps you to distinguish both what is unique and what is typical about her self-expression. Social history, in that respect, is a biographer's Rosetta Stone, since the shared ideas of a generation, the current events, the jokes, the slang, the fads and scandals, the newspaper headlines and fashions, all supply you with an essential lexicon. I Became Alone included versions of the essays on women writers that I had begun to publish under the rubric Lost Women in the recently launched Ms. magazine. The second feminist wave occasioned a, quote, revolution in literary history, as Phyllis Rose puts it in her vibrant essay collection, Writing of Women. The lives of misread women were being examined by a new generation of literary biographers, some of them friends like Phyllis and Jean Strauss, whose life of Alice James rescued it from the shadows of her brothers, and Martha Saxton, who wrote the first feminist biography of Louisa May Alcott. The case of Woolf, according to Rose, quote, provides a fascinating example, end quote, of the reclamation process. Quote, women rediscovered her first and claimed her as a great woman writer. Then she moved into the higher pantheon of the genderless greats. This rediscovery is all the more fascinating because Woolf had been there all along, hardly unknown. But she was, in a sense, not the same writer we see now. She was there in 1950s guise, as a fragile, ethereal woman too otherworldly to live, as a fragile, ethereal novelist of the inner life, end quote. Rose discerned Woolf's acuity as a social critic, and more to the point, her tough-mindedness. Isak Dinesen wasn't exactly a lost woman, although by the early 70s she was somewhat in eclipse. And when I was working on the biography, I got very tired of answering the question, who's he? Her fans make an unlikely club of odd couples, Hannah Arendt and Truman Capote, Ernest Hemingway and Gloria Steinem. Gloria, the co-editor-in-chief of Ms., commissioned a profile of Dinesen, and after a number of false starts, I framed it, pourquoi pas, as a conversation with an elderly Danish noblewoman living in Tuscany who had supposedly been one of Dinesen's childhood friends. This countess was an invention, and our dialogue a feat of ventriloquism, but the interview wasn't labeled imaginary by the magazine. We stupidly thought that was obvious, and more than one reader was fooled, including Dinesen's secretary and executor, Clara Svensson, who wrote me an indignant letter demanding to know the true identity of my interlocutor so that she could correct some of her misapprehensions. Here I should say that purely by chance, there was an old countess still living who had known Dinesen in their youth, and who, when I met her some 3 years later at her country house, sounded and looked uncannily like the figure I had conjured. She even raised the same breed of dog, Dandy Dinmonts. But there was something even uncannier about my imposture. Some 40 years later, rereading the profile, I realized that the voice of the Countess sounded just like mine at the same age, about 70, speaking from the future. Invention has no place in biography, although some of you might not agree. But the profile of Dinesen that launched my career was and remains the only piece of prose I have ever written blithely. I was enjoying the luxury of a mask and of projecting the responsibility for what I had to say onto a character. This is a tactic for which I envy novelists, and one that I had learned from Dinesen, who describes how writing under a pseudonym, particularly one of ambiguous gender, confers a sense of freedom. Unfortunately, I have only ever recaptured that freedom in Scrabble chat rooms. The profile attracted the attention of a young editor at St. Martin's Press, Michael Denny, who had studied with Hannah Arendt at the University of Chicago. We met for dinner in 1974 at one of the first restaurants to open in Soho, and Michael brought a copy of Men in Dark Times, a collection of Arendt's essays, which I can recommend for our own dark times. The men included Dinesen and Rosa Luxemburg. But as I was looking for an elderly gentleman in tweeds, and he a middle-aged lady with a bun, we couldn't initially find each other. Later that evening, both of us 3 martinis to the wind, Michael invited me to write Dinesen's life, and without undue reflection, I declined. He might have studied with the Committee for Social Thought, I told him, but my education was unsystematic, and I had never produced a piece of prose longer than 10 pages. At our next dinner, by which time my vanity had undermined most of my resolve and martinis the rest, I tried to discourage Michael's suit by asking for an advance that seemed so fantastical, I was sure he would let me off the hook. $10,000. He offered 11. Isak Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller, was published in 1982. It was composed on an IBM Selectric that's still in my basement. 7 years of research, interviews, and reporting on 3 continents were recorded on 3x5 cards, and every footnote had to be hand-numbered. The manuscript ran to 1,000 pages, and when it came back from the copy editor, by mail, of course, he had attached a wry little note that said, "I have found 2 words consistently misspelled, and I thought that this might interest you as a student of psychology. The words are separate and desperate." It did interest me. The drama of merging and separation is pertinent, if not fundamental, to the art of biography. One inhabits a subject's life more intensely, or at least more purposefully, than one inhabits one's own. I cannot tell you where I was at 3 o'clock last Friday, but I could once tell you where Baroness Blixen was on a Friday at 3 o'clock Nairobi time a century ago. Whatever dispassion you set out with, you will lose it. You will hate your subject and wish her dead, forgetting that she's long gone. You will resent her control of your existence as you once did your parents. She will sucker you into codependence, and God help you if you don't resist. As she loses her mystery, she will disillusion you. Idolatry and disillusionment are biographies Scylla and Charybdis, and I'm not sure which is deadlier. Admitting your antipathies is a first step toward transcending them. Jean Strauss once told me that when she was at an impasse with J.P. Morgan, she asked his ghost why he was confounding her. "Because you don't like me," the ghost replied. There are no pure human prisms that refract the life of a subject without distortion. When you are translating an epic with many ellipses, lost passages, and obscure references, it's always into your own sentences. One aims to translate it faithfully, but what is fidelity? The transcription school of biography sticks timidly to the shore of fact, accounting for every petty quarrel, doctor's appointment, thank you note, orgasm, and pair of gloves. Such biographies are useful to the scholar, but they cheat a lay reader of something vibrant and sensuous, the deep poetry of a life, which requires a feat of imaginative affinity. Achieving dispassion is a biographer's supreme challenge. Perhaps no one understood it better, partly by default, than my friend James Atlas, who died a year ago this month. The Shadow in the Garden, A Biographer's Tale, is an essential memoir on the travails of literary biography, written with dispassion for his own failings. A biographer's real subject, Jim concluded, is the nature of intimacy. You cannot succeed in knowing someone else unless you know yourself. Colette put it somewhat differently to a young writer who had come to her for advice on a literary career. When you are capable of certifying that today's work is equal to yesterday's, she said, you will have earned your stripes. For I am convinced that talent is nothing other than the possibility of resembling oneself from one day to the next, whatever else befalls you. In order to resemble oneself, one has to achieve a degree of fairly stable self-possession that I think, at least until recently, and even now in milieux less privileged than ours, has been more elusive for women than for men. It's striking to me how many of the women I have written about have fallen prey to the same temptation, to fetishize uniqueness as a strategy for resisting a generic definition imposed by someone else. The witch, the sibyl, the saint, the priestess, the misfit, the martyr, the fury, the eccentric, the great sinner. These are some of their guises. Men suffer from grandiosity too, of course, for the same reason, insecurity, but their fantasies run to omnipotence. It's easy to forget, though, just how hard it was for a young woman to claim her singularity without insisting on it didactically. I was reminded of that injustice last week by yet another obituary of a remarkable woman, Joan Feynman, the groundbreaking astrophysicist who died at 93. She had, as a girl, wanted to follow in the footsteps of her elder brother, Richard, the future Nobelist, but their mother tried to, quote, crush the impulse. Women's brains can't do science, she told the young Joan. This is such a common generalization, so often repeated in so many variations, that one might think it doesn't bear repeating. Yet it bears repeating in a moment in history when so many hard-won freedoms seem so terrifyingly provisional. It took me 6.5 years to bulldoze my way through a first draft of Dinesen, and for most of them I had no idea what I was doing. Eventually I found a Virgil in Leon Adel, not the man whom I never met or spoke with, his 5-volume biography of Henry James. You're going about this the wrong way, my dear, Adel's masterpiece whispered to me paternally. You cannot tell an unwieldy story in long chapters. You cannot think about time in terms of years. You have to organize your narrative as a sequence of discrete moments, which is, after all, how one lives. Try writing in brief canto-like sections, some consisting only of a few paragraphs. When you have solved the problems of each one, its weight, its tone, its structure, its focus, you can set it aside until you see where it goes. You then have a deck of cards you can shuffle. And that strategy gives you a precious foretaste of completion that buoys your morale for the long haul. Once I had adopted Adel's technique, things began falling into place. I rewrote Dinesen in a single winter of solitary nights, from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m, holed up in a bungalow near Rockaway Beach. Convinced that where my subject speaks of life's 3 forms of perfect happiness, she must have been thinking of finishing a biography. First, the cessation of pain. Second, a sudden excess of strength. Third, the feeling one is fulfilling one's destiny. I rewrote Colette in the same way, in 3 months of breathtakingly productive 12-hour days in a trance of ecstasy after 8 years of torture. I only really began to appreciate my extraordinary luck in drawing Dinesen as a first subject when I'd lived for a few years with Colette. Dinesen's was an out-of-the-way tomb. Not only had her archives never been plundered, they hadn't been unsealed. She had lived well more than half her life before she began to write, and she published only 7 major books. There were lucid, unsentimental witnesses who remembered her childhood and her life in Kenya. Her African letters were still in manuscript, and in them I could hear her voice before fame stilted it. But I didn't know, when I began, that Dinesen herself would become my most generous collaborator. At the beginning, her reticence seemed nearly absolute, yet I would discover that it was, in fact, purely a formal test. She wanted, even yearned to be known. Proud, capricious, haughty, riddling, mythomaniacal, she was all of that. But she still had, from beyond the tomb, in relation to posterity, a sense of fair play, of humble, old-fashioned, indeed anachronistic, propriety toward the truth. I wrestled with Dinesen for 7 years, a nice biblical number, and like the angel in the parable of Jacob that was so dear to her heart, she let me go, I felt, with the blessing. The image of that combat, so grandiose and cerebral, and as are all folie à deux, so dubiously chaste, would have made Colette smile, and I don't delude myself as to how. Dinesen's creed of honor, her idealism, her belief in fate, and her religiosity, not to mention her drug use and anorexia, would have seemed, I'm sure, insufferable to Colette. I have no sporting qualities, Colette asserted. She wanted to dominate, not meet her match. She never let go with a blessing. There were certain sacrifices that she made for her art, not all of them conscious and none of them willing. But life wasn't one. Colette began writing at 24, living turbulently and working tirelessly, her powers waxing as she aged. Her collected works in the Pleiad edition, with its paper as fine as tissue, run to some 7,000 pages of small print. Her published correspondence fills 7 volumes. Her critics and biographers have been, if anything, more prolific than she has. But those were the least, or at any rate the most superficial, of my problems as her biographer. A friend of Colette's old age would note that her art is that of the lie, but the great game she plays with us is to stuff her lies with flashes of truth. I found that insight perversely consoling. The candor of Colette's best writing is an illusion, just as her celebrated physical immodesty is misleading. She has, as Dominique Horry puts it, a fierce modesty of sentiment. Not only does she refuse to collaborate with her biographer, she slams the door on you. People often used to ask me, why Colette? One answer is that when I proposed writing her life in 1990, I was a single mother of 42 with a year-old son. I needed to be frank, big advance, and for a big advance, you need a juicy subject. Even then, the biggest advance for a literary biography, after you have paid taxes, travel and research expenses, your agent, your shrink, your babysitter, and your health insurance as a freelancer, generally amortizes in the course of a decade down to the salary of a dental assistant in New Jersey. Various projects were proposed to me, and I was courted by the executors of several literary estates. I would actually never undertake a book about a living subject for a number of reasons, the danger of beholdenness prime among them, but mostly because I hate suspense. I have to know how a story ends. As I contemplated the field, Oscar Wilde's witty caution came back to me. Remarriage is the triumph of hope over experience. Then one day, 2 friends wrote to me independently, they didn't know each other, suggesting Colette. One, a male novelist of great renown, was teaching a course on the masterpieces of erotic literature, and he was disgusted with the prissy academic treatment of Colette's power and frankness on the subject, as he saw it. The other, a female memoirist legendary in Scandinavia, was writing an essay on Colette's egotism as a mother and a daughter. She was disgusted by the way Colette's biographers had sentimentalized her human and animal relationships. And sentimentality, one might note, is another form of generalization. It's a story about S&M, my friend said. Perfect for you. The question why Colette took me some time to answer for myself, partly because I so often found her unsympathetic, especially as a mother and an anti-Semite. But here is where I part ways with cancel culture. A biographer may be a judge, but not a prosecutor or a jury. Reaching a verdict is the prerogative of a reader. Colette deserved and rewarded the efforts that I made to do her justice. She was a peerless writer of sentences, one of the supreme stylists in French, And while she was a militant anti-feminist in her puerile proclamations on the subject, she branded herself as a contrarian both in the old sense of the word and in the modern one. She may have been the first great philosopher of sex to arrive at the insight in 1900 in her first Claudine novel that gender is a subjective construct. Claudine was something new in literature, the century's first teenage girl, a tough-talking, bisexual, erotic rebel, reckless and disturbed, by turns beguiled and repulsed at her discovery of what it means to become a woman. How to liberate my true hope, Claudine asks herself. Everything is against me. The first obstacle to my escape is this woman's body barring my way. Colette's true hope was revolutionary, even though the world she lived in was hostile to it. She aspired to androgyny, a state of being in which so-called male and female desires coexist in a body and a mind of either gender without contradiction. So I'm dismayed when a cool young French girl who's read too much Bataille shrugs at Colette's name and tells me she's someone whom her granny read sous le bonnet, under the hairdryer. Or when an old actor who once emoted Giraudoux natters on about Colette's cats. Or when the name of Sido, Colette's mother, is invoked as a paragon of selfless maternity. It was Sido, after all, who told Colette that there is only one person in this world whom you can count on, and that's yourself. It is extremely doubtful that Colette read Nietzsche, as I know Dinesen did. But both of them absorbed his motto, which was the byword of their generation, become thyself. That imperative was still urgent to me more than half a century later in my London bedsit, and continues to be urgent for girls in most cultures. How can you become an individual, yourself, and a woman? That question resonates like a leitmotif in the work of my subjects, who are otherwise a disparate lot. You can hear it in the belligerent fiction of Elena Ferrante, the courageous journalism of Margaret Fuller, born in 1810, America's first female war correspondent, in Alison Bechdel's graphic memoirs about daughterhood as a closeted lesbian, in Rachel Cusk's heresies about marriage and motherhood, in the critique of clerical misogyny that Sor Juana addressed to her bishop 400 years ago in the guise of an apologia before bowing to his will, though he couldn't gag her for posterity. Nowhere, perhaps, is the question more crucial or burning than in the novels of Toni Morrison. What they ask is the price of owning yourself if you or your child or your ancestors, your beloveds, have been owned by someone else. I'm coming to the end of this lecture with a certain discomfort about having droned on for nearly an hour about the mysteries of individuation, a luxury for most humans on the planet, as democracy is under siege in the midst of a pandemic that has left 1 million dead. But then I think of my step-granddaughters, Stella and Alice, one nearly 3, one 8 weeks old, who will, with any luck, live well into the 21st century, if there is one. What do I hope for them? The hope that RBG gave her life to as a jurist, and to which, infinitely more modestly, I have given mine to, that they realize their hopes for themselves. Thank you very much and good night.